All right, settle down, everyone. Welcome to class. Grab your pens, open those notebooks because we've got a lot of ground to cover in today's History Explainer. We are stepping back into a decade of massive societal upheaval to break down the 1960s women's liberation movement. Before we jump in, let's hit the do now on Malcolm X's 1965 assassination in Washington Heights. Just add a quick appositive to describe that event in your notes. Also, quick housekeeping. Quiz makeups are at lunch today, tomorrow is a half day, and our unit exam is Thursday, May 22nd. We only have 19 classes left until the Regents, so we really gotta focus up. Okay, let's dive into this. Our agenda for today is simple. We're doing our welcome to class, looking at how second wave feminism begins, taking a quick pop quiz on Betty Friedan, breaking down equal pay and Title IX, and finally measuring the movement's impact. Section 1. Welcome to class. Setting the 1960s scene. To really understand the 1960s, you have to picture the incredibly rigid roles women were pushed into. We're talking widespread, systemic discrimination, especially when it came to getting a job or an education. The expectation for a woman's place in society was heavily restricted. And man, that immense pressure cooker of limitation is exactly what sparked a massive pushback. So I need everyone to write this exact definition down. Highlight it, star it, whatever works for you, because it's the foundation for this whole unit. Feminism, the advocacy of women's rights and the equality of the sexes. That concept is the beating heart of the movement we're studying today. Got it? Awesome. Section 2. Second wave feminism begins. The grassroots frustration. We call this the second wave because, if you remember, the first wave earlier in the century was all about gaining the right to vote, suffrage. This second wave, it was born out of deep grassroots frustration regarding the daily realities women faced at home and at work. And every movement needs a spark, right? Enter Betty Friedan. She is widely considered the undisputed leader of the women's liberation movement during this era. Back in 1963, she wrote a highly influential book called The Feminine Mystique. In it, Friedan argued that women across the country were deeply frustrated. They were constantly being told their only path to fulfillment was being a wife and mother. But Friedan pointed out that women needed meaningful careers just as much as men did. Let's look at a primary source excerpt from her work, describing what she famously called the problem that has no name. Listen to the emotion here. She wrote, "Each suburban wife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even herself the silent question, is this all?" Just imagine the quiet desperation in that question. That was the emotional reality of the 1950s and 60s suburban housewife. But Friedan didn't just write a book and call it a day. She channeled all that widespread frustration into organized action. She founded the National Organization for Women, or NOW. Make sure you jot this organization down in your notes. NOW became the absolute engine for the movement. They drove real political action to increase support for sex equality through organized protests, marches, and direct lobbying of the government. Section 3. Pop quiz Betty Friedan, Regents exam practice. All right, pencils down, eyes up front. Let's do a quick mid-class check for understanding to see who's paying attention in the back. Here's a classic multiple-choice question you might actually see on the Regents exam. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan was an influential book in the 1960s because it A. strengthened family values, B. led to the 19th Amendment, C. energized a new women's rights movement, or D. reinforced traditional roles. I'll give you a second to think critically about what we just covered. If you guessed C, you nailed it. So the crucial point here is that Betty Friedan didn't reinforce traditional roles. Her writing directly sparked and energized the second wave of the women's rights movement. She gave a literal voice to the problem that has no name, and that voice demanded change. Section 4. Equal Pay and Title IX. From Protests to Legislation. Now we're pivoting from grassroots frustration to the sweeping government actions and massive legislative victories that followed. Because protests are incredibly powerful, but eventually they have to translate into the actual law of the land. Let's move through this and see how it builds over a single, ridiculously consequential decade. In 1963, Congress passes the Equal Pay Act. Right on its heels in 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed, which banned job discrimination. And then, a few years later in 1972, Congress passes Title IX. That is an unbelievable amount of momentum generated by the movement in such a short period of time. But remember, this legislation wasn't just politely handed to them. Women were out on the streets, holding signs that read things like, "Agitate now for equal pay." They had to publicly agitate, they had to be highly visible, and they had to apply intense, relentless pressure to finally force Congress to pass the Equal Pay Act in 1963. And then comes the monumental 1972 Title IX legislation. I want you to write this down clearly. Title IX mandated that federally funded schools could no longer discriminate on the basis of sex. Think about the gravity of that. If a university or a high school took a single dime from the federal government, they had to provide equal opportunities. It was basically a scale, balancing the scales for men and women. This drastically and permanently altered the landscape of educational opportunities for women in America. Section 5. Measuring the movement's impact. Analyzing the class data. So they marched, they lobbied, and they actually got the laws passed. But did it work? For this final part of the class, I want you to put your history hats aside for a second and put on your data analyst hats. Let's look at the complexity of progress using some modern primary data. Now, what's really interesting about this is when you look at STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. On one hand, women now make up 29% of the STEM labor force and about half of all biological scientists. That is a massive leap forward from the 1960s. But then you zoom in on the top jobs, and among STEM industry CEOs, only 3% are women. So the data tells a dual story. Incredible progress has been made for sure, but the fight for full equality in the higher tiers of the workforce, that's still very much an ongoing battle. And we can clearly see the specific impact of Title IX in education. If you track the data on college degrees over time, there's this dramatic moment in 1981 where the numbers literally cross. That's the exact moment women surpassed men in earning college degrees, a trend that's only continued to grow and currently sits at around 60%. And then there's high school sports. Before Title IX in 1971, there were roughly 294,000 girls participating. By 2018, that number had absolutely exploded to over 3.4 million. These aren't just dry statistics. They are the direct, undeniable, life-changing results of the women's liberation movement and the legislation they fought so hard for. Wow, look at the time. That's the bell right on cue. Before you pack up your bags and run out of here, here is your homework assignment. I want you to think critically about Betty Friedan's words. Write a short paragraph answering this. Where do we still see the problem that has no name in society today? Think about the expectations placed on people right now in your own modern lives. Have a great rest of your day. Definitely study for that upcoming exam, and class is dismissed.